Picture this for a second. It is April 9th, 2007. We are in the Khatimia neighborhood of northwestern Baghdad.
Right, twilight is just starting to fall.
Exactly. Twilight. The air smells like this crazy mix of diesel exhaust, burning trash, and, flatbread. And a group of American paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division steps out of the concrete blast walls of their base.
And they are weighed down.
Heavily. They are burdened by over 60 pounds of gear. Kevlar helmets, M4 rifles, night vision goggles, heavy ceramic plates just pressing against their chests.
I mean, that's exhausting just to think about in that heat.
Oh, absolutely. And every single step they take is calculated. But here's the thing. They aren't storming a beachhead. They aren't like maneuvering to flank an enemy army.
No, they are just walking down a residential street.
Right. Intensely scanning piles of garbage and parked cars, basically trying not to get blown up by an artillery shell wired to a garage door opener.
Because they are hunting an enemy that is essentially everywhere, and yet completely nowhere at all. An enemy that absolutely refuses to wear a uniform, doesn't hold a front line in any traditional military sense, and just, completely ignores the conventional rules of warfare.
Right. And then, instead of calling in an airstrike or coordinating an artillery barrage, the platoon leader, a guy named Captain David Brunet, stops at an outdoor cafe.
Just a local spot.
Yeah. He takes off his helmet. He sits down in a cheap plastic lawn chair right next to some middle-aged Iraqi men smoking hookah pipes, and he drinks a Pepsi.
It's such a surreal image.
It really is. He talks to them through an Iraqi interpreter, but the interpreter has to wear a thick ski mask in the sweltering heat just to hide his identity, so his family doesn't get murdered in the middle of the night.
Wow. Yeah, the stakes are just incredibly high for the locals.
They joke about the local soccer teams, and the captain tries to explain why the roads are closed, all while subtly trying to read their faces. He's trying to gather intelligence about where the local insurgents are hiding, and that is the mission.
Slow, frustrating, and just psychologically draining.
Immensely draining. Which really brings us to the central question of today's deep dive. How on earth did the world's most technologically advanced, incredibly funded military find itself bogged down fighting an invisible enemy armed with weapons that look like they were built in a basement?
It's the ultimate question, right? And to truly understand how we ended up in that cafe in Baghdad, we have to embark on a sweeping 5,000-year journey today.
5 millennia.
Exactly. Our mission in this deep dive is to peel back the layers of military history. We're pulling exclusively from Max Boot's incredibly comprehensive text, Invisible Armies. We want to show you that this new kind of asymmetric war, the kind you see on your newsfeed every single day, is actually the oldest form of human conflict on Earth.
It's older than the wheel, almost.
Just about. We're going to trace the evolution of the guerrilla fighter from the very dawn of civilization in ancient Mesopotamia, right through the height of the Roman Empire, into the liberal revolutions of the 18th century, the bloody wars of empire, and all the way to the modern rise of radical Islam.
And along the way, we are going to unpack something really fascinating. The guerrilla paradox.
The guerrilla paradox, yes. The historical puzzle of how the weak, the underfunded, and the outgunned consistently manage to defeat the strong.
It defies all conventional logic. But before we step into the historical mechanics of all this, we need to lay out a really clear framework for you, the listener.
Definitely, yeah, it's crucial.
Because to map this out, we are going to be discussing some intensely political, deeply religious, and frankly, incredibly violent conflicts.
Right, from the Ku Klux Klan to Al-Qaeda, as well as the brutal tactics of various historical empires and revolutionary movements.
Exactly. So I want to be absolutely clear right up front. We are strictly analyzing the military tactics, the psychological strategies, and the historical impacts of these groups based on our source material.
We're exploring the cold mechanics of how they fought and the specific reasons why they succeeded or failed.
Right. We are not endorsing, validating, or taking sides on any of the ideologies, religions, or political movements we discuss today. Our lens is purely historical analysis.
Purely historical.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to figure out why an American captain is drinking Pepsi with a masked interpreter in 2007, we actually have to rewind all the way back to the Bronze Age.
Back to the very origins of the organized state.
Yeah, because the moment humanity figured out how to build a regular army, they accidentally invented the irregular army, too.
It's a fascinating cause and effect relationship that honestly most people miss. Think about humanity before the invention of agriculture.
Just roaming around.
Right. For tens of thousands of years, all warfare was essentially tribal raiding. It was loosely organized, lightly armed, and relied entirely on stealth, ambush, and surprise.
So in a sense, primitive guerrilla warfare was the default setting of the human race.
It was the only setting. But then, around 3000 BC in Mesopotamia, something radical happens. Agriculture creates a massive surplus of food and wealth.
And once you have a massive pile of grain, you need to protect it.
Precisely. Surplus wealth allows for the construction of walled cities. And walled cities require professional full-time specialists to guard them.
Because you can't have the farmers dropping their plows every time a raider shows up over the hill.
Exactly. So the conventional army is born. Heavy infantry, organized logistics, hierarchical command structures.
And the first guy to really put this together on a massive imperial scale is Sargon of Akkad, around 2334 BC.
The world's first true emperor.
Yeah, Sargon builds the first standing army in recorded history. He conquers his neighbors, he grandiosely dubs himself king of the world, and he creates the Akkadian Empire. He is the ultimate, untouchable, conventional power of his day. I mean, he has the armor, he has the numbers, he has the wealth.
But Sargon's magnificent empire almost immediately ran into a lethal problem. A problem that conventional armies have struggled with for the next 5 millennia.
Which is?
His heavy, slow-moving professional troops, who were explicitly designed to fight other heavy, slow-moving troops on open plains, were completely vulnerable to people who still fought the old way.
The irregulars.
Specifically, neighboring mountain peoples like the Gadusians who lived in the jagged Zagros Mountains in modern-day Iran.
I love how the settled Mesopotamians talked about these guys. The surviving clay tablets from the time described the Egyptians as fanged serpents and lawless barbarians.
You could just feel the sheer visceral terror in those descriptions.
Yeah. It wasn't just that they were losing battles, they were terrified of the very way the Gutians fought.
That psychological reaction, that deep, visceral fear and absolute hatred of the rootless, unconventional fighter is something that echoes through every single century of history.
So the Gutians were essentially the first successful insurgents on record.
They absolutely were. They didn't march down for the mountains and line up in a neat row to engage Sargon's heavy infantry in a pitched battle. That would be mass suicide.
So what do?
Instead, they raided the supply lines, they pillaged the outlying farms, they ambushed patrols, they exhausted the Akkadian state, bleeding it economically and psychologically until it completely collapsed. And this dynamic didn't just plague the early Mesopotamians. If we fast forward a couple of thousand years to the ultimate, undisputed military machine of the ancient world, the Roman Empire, we see the exact same vulnerability playing out on an even larger scale.
Oh, the Romans. I mean, when you think of a conventional military, the Roman legion is the absolute gold standard. The discipline alone was terrifying. They marched in total silence in a strict checkerboard formation.
Incredible engineering and psychological conditioning.
Tell me about the actual mechanics of a Roman legionary. What made them so devastating in a conventional fight?
Well, a Roman legionary carried a massive, curved, rectangular shield called a scutum. It weighed about 16 pounds and interlocked with the shields of the men next to him to form literally an impenetrable wall.
Like a human tank.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they carried heavy 7-foot javelins called pilums. The genius of the pilum was that the iron shank was designed to bend upon impact.
Wait, really? It was designed to bend?
Yes. So if a Roman threw it into your wooden shield, it would bend, meaning you couldn't pull it out and throw it back at them.
That is brilliant.
It also made your shield so front-heavy and cumbersome that you had to just drop it, leaving you completely exposed. Then, the Romans would crash into your lines with that massive wall of shields and systematically stab you with a short sword, the gladius, from behind their defense.
That is just terrifying efficiency, and the discipline to maintain that wall. If a Roman unit broke ranks or retreated, they faced decimation, where the commanders would literally order the soldiers to beat every 10th man in their own unit to death with clubs.
Brutal, but effective. Running away was simply not an option. You stand and fight.
So they were practically an unstoppable force of nature, provided you fought them on an open plain where they could maneuver, maintain their formations, and use their heavy equipment.
Right, provided you play by their rules.
But what happens when you take that heavy, rigid, hyper-disciplined machine and put it in the wrong physical environment?
It falls apart.
Right.
We have a perfect historical example of this. The ambush of Beth Horon in AD 66.
Okay, set the scene for us. This is during the Jewish revolt, right?
Yes. A Roman commander named Cestius Gallus is marching the 12th Legion. which is thousands of heavily armed men, basically a modern U.S. Army brigade, through these incredibly narrow, winding mountain paths near Jerusalem.
Wait, so they are walking uphill through a rocky desert pass, carrying the equivalent of a modern soldier's heavy rucksack. We are talking 60 to 100 pounds of armor, weapons, rations, and camp-building tools, but without any ergonomic support.
Just strapped to their backs in the blazing sun.
That sounds miserable.
They are exhausted, they're strung out in a long, vulnerable column, and completely unable to form their famous defensive checkerboard. And the Jewish fighters, who were lightly armed, unarmored, and highly mobile, knew better than to face the Romans at the bottom of the hill.
They used the terrain.
They climbed the cliffs, they fired slingshots, arrows, and javelins from the high ground. When the Roman column broke into complete chaos, the rebels dashed down the rocks, picked off the stragglers with knives, and then literally melted back into the hills before the Romans could swing their heavy swords.
Because the Roman soldiers couldn't possibly chase them up the cliffs in heavy armor.
Exactly. The legion was absolutely annihilated. They lost their siege equipment, their pride, and thousands of men. It was a textbook guerrilla victory of mobility over mass.
So how did these massive empires actually respond to this? Because they obviously didn't just roll over, disband the empire, and go home.
Not at all.
If you are Rome, or if you are the brutal Assyrian Empire before them, and you have these invisible armies picking your heavy legions apart from the shadows, what is your counterinsurgency playbook? How do you fight smoke?
For most of antiquity, the primary counterinsurgency strategy can be summed up in one horrific word:
Terror. Just pure terror.
Ancient monarchs didn't have to worry about public opinion polls, international media, or human rights tribunals. When the Assyrian Empire dealt with rebels, they used performative, unimaginable brutality. They literally flayed captured rebels alive and draped their skins over the city walls as a warning.
Yeah, I recall there is a quote from an Assyrian king boasting that he built a pillar at the city gate and covered it with the ripped-off skins of the rebel leaders. It is just pure psychological warfare.
He's telling the population, this is the price of defying the state.
And the Romans, for all their civilized engineering and philosophy, could be equally barbaric when their authority was challenged, couldn't they?
Oh, absolutely. Consider the Germanic tribesmen led by Arminius. In 89, Arminius lured 3 entire Roman legions into the deep bogs and thick woods of the Teutoburg forest.
Another classic ambush.
Where the dense terrain completely negated the Roman advantages of formation and heavy armor. The legions were slaughtered. In response, the Romans didn't try to win the hearts and minds of the Germanic tribes.
What did they do?
Over the following years, they sent massive armies back across the Rhine to engage in total slaughter, burning every village and killing everyone they could find. A British tribal chief, Calgacus, famously described the Roman method of pacification. He said, they create a desert and call it peace.
They create a desert and call it peace. That sends chills down my spine. You just kill everyone until there is no one left to rebel.
It's the darkest form of conflict resolution.
But history also shows that Rome wasn't just a blunt instrument of terror, right? They actually had some pretty sophisticated, almost shockingly modern tactics to deal with insurgents.
They did, because they eventually realized that pure brutality sometimes just creates a more desperate, hardened rebellion, so they employed targeted assassinations.
Okay. Who?
Let's look at 139 BC in the Iberian Peninsula, modern-day Spain. There was a brilliant guerrilla leader named Viriathus. He was a humble shepherd who intimately knew the local hills. He kept luring heavy Roman forces into elaborate ambushes using agile horses.
Sadly, couldn't catch him.
The Romans chased him for years but couldn't catch him in the field. So instead of burning down the whole province, the Roman commanders simply found 3 of Viriathus's trusted officers and bribed them with vast amounts of gold.
What?
They murdered Viriathus in his sleep. Without his specific charismatic leadership holding the various tribes together, the entire rebellion instantly fractured and collapsed.
So bribery and decapitation of the leadership.
Exactly. And Rome also used psychological warfare that didn't involve bloodshed.
How so?
During the siege of Jerusalem in AD 70, the Roman commander Titus actually paused his massive assault. He ordered his entire army to put on their most gleaming, polished parade armor and march in perfect, terrifying synchronization right in front of the city walls.
Like a military parade in the middle of a war.
Yes, and he paid them their wages in plain sight of the starving defenders. It was a calculated demonstration of infinite resources and discipline designed purely to terrify the rebels into giving up.
It is the ancient equivalent of shock and awe, just flying the stealth bombers low over the city to show off the hardware and break their psychological will.
That's a perfect comparison.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting, because we have this pervasive historical myth today that guerrilla warfare is somehow an inherently Eastern invention.
Right, the Orientalist trope.
Yeah. People read Sun Tzu's The Art of War, they look at the incredible successes of Mao Zedong in China and Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam in the 20th century, and they assume there is some mystical, indirect Asian way of fighting that is totally opposed to the Western tradition of a toe-to-toe bloody brawl. But our source material completely debunks this.
Completely. Modern military historians have sometimes leaned heavily into this idea of an Eastern way of war that is entirely based on evasion, deception, and delay. But if you look at the archaeological and historical record, ancient Chinese armies were just as massive, hierarchical, rigidly disciplined, and conventionally minded as the Roman legions.
Right. Look at the famous terracotta warriors buried with China's first emperor, Qin Shi Huang.
Exactly. You have thousands of life-sized, heavily armored infantrymen arranged in strict, rigid geometric formations. That is not a guerrilla force emphasizing hit-and-run tactics. That is a massive, conventional war machine designed to crush the enemy in a pitched battle.
So who are the actual guerrillas in Asia then?
They weren't the Chinese imperial state. They were the nomadic tribes living on the fringes of the empire. Groups like the Xiongnu, who tormented the Han Dynasty for centuries.
These were the incredible horse archers, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
They didn't have cities to defend. They would sweep down from the steppes, burn the crops, steal the loot, and simply vanish back into the massive expanse of Central Asia long before the slow-moving, heavy imperial infantry could even mobilize to catch them.
It is that exact same dynamic playing out across the globe. Sargon versus the Yushans, Rome versus the Germanic tribes, Han China versus the Xiongnu.
Which brings us to the absolute core concept of the guerrilla paradox.
Oh.
Why do the weak beat the strong?
Right. Mechanically, how does a guy on a horse with a bow defeat a billion-dollar empire?
It comes down to fundamentally different strategies of conflict. A conventional army seeks annihilation. They want to find the enemy's main force, trap it in a decisive battle, destroy it quickly, and dictate the terms of peace.
The knockout punch.
Yes, but a guerrilla force seeks attrition. They know with absolute certainty that they will lose a pitched battle, so they simply refuse to fight one.
They just don't show up to the boxing ring.
Exactly. They stretch the conflict out over years or even decades. They inflict 1,000 tiny cuts. They ambush supply wagons. They harass outposts. They make the occupation so exhausting, so expensive, and so incredibly frustrating that the conventional power simply loses the political will or the economic resources to keep fighting, and they pack up and go home.
It's basically a waiting game. I like to think of it like modern business.
Oh, yeah.
The ancient empires are these massive, sluggish corporate monopolies. They have all the money, they have the massive headquarters, they have tens of thousands of employees, but they cannot pivot. They move incredibly slowly.
Okay, I follow.
The nomadic guerrillas are like agile tech startups. They have zero overhead, no permanent address. They move fast, they disrupt the market, and the moment the monopoly tries to sue them or crush them with a massive legal team, they just dissolve and reappear under a different name.
That is a remarkably accurate analogy.
But that raises a major question for me, and I want to push back on this a bit.
Go ahead.
If the nomads were so incredibly good at this startup guerrilla warfare, if it is the ultimate way to defeat an empire, why didn't they just keep doing it? Because historically, groups like the Mongols or the Manchus eventually conquer the massive state, and then they stop being guerrillas. Why abandon the winning formula?
That is a brilliant question because it reveals the ultimate limitation of the guerrilla.
Yeah.
You could tear down an empire from horseback, but you cannot administer a state from horseback.
Oh, that makes sense.
Once a nomadic group successfully collapses a state and decides, hey, we want to run this place now, their entire strategic reality flips upside down. Suddenly, they have physical borders to defend against other nomads. They have millions of citizens to police. They have complex taxation systems to manage.
You can't collect taxes by doing a hit-and-run raid on your own citizens.
Exactly. You cannot do any of that with a loose band of hit-and-run raiders who only know how to ambush and retreat. Furthermore, if you want to take a massive, fortified city like Constantinople or Beijing, light cavalry firing arrows will do absolutely nothing against 40-foot stone walls.
You need massive cannons, thousands of heavy infantrymen, and professional siege engineers.
So the ultimate historical irony is that the moment a guerrilla force actually achieves total victory, It is forced to become the very conventional power it just destroyed. It becomes the slow, heavy monopoly, making it immediately vulnerable to the next generation of agile guerrillas.
Wow. Okay, so for thousands of years, this cycle just repeats endlessly. And for the most part, it is deeply tribal, it is primitive, and it is almost totally apolitical. You are fighting for loot or for territory or simply because your tribe hates the other tribe.
Right. Ideology isn't really a huge factor yet.
But then, as we move into the 17th and 18th centuries in Europe, the entire equation of human conflict fundamentally changes. The actual rules of war get rewritten, and the modern insurgent is born.
If we connect this to the broader trajectory of history, the major turning point here is the Peace of Westphalia in 1648.
This was the treaty that ended the 30 Years' War in Europe, right?
Yes, which was an unimaginably destructive, chaotic conflict where roaming bands of mercenaries just devastated the continent. The Peace of Westphalia essentially formalized the modern nation-state system. It declared that only legitimate, recognized states had the right to wage war. And with formal states came formal, professional, standing armies governed by strict, aristocratic codes of conduct.
And uniforms. This seems like such a trivial cosmetic detail, but it changed the mechanics of warfare forever.
How so?
Well, the British wore bright red coats, the French wore pristine white, the Prussians wore deep blue. Once everyone has a brightly colored uniform, you can instantly, visually separate a soldier from a civilian across a smoky battlefield.
Right.
And by extension, anyone who picks up a musket and fights without a uniform is no longer considered a lawful combatant by the state. They become an irregular. They are a partisan. They are operating outside the newly agreed upon civilized laws of war. They are essentially viewed as armed criminals.
You nailed it. The state claimed a monopoly on violence, and the irregular fighter threatened that monopoly. And the most dramatic, world-altering collision between these formal European rules and irregular tactics happens right here in North America during the American Revolution.
The British Army of the 1770s was the finest, most disciplined conventional force on the planet.
Yes, but on April 19, 1775, at the Battle of Lexington and Concord, they walked straight into a buzzsaw.
Yeah, we learn about this in elementary school, but we rarely look at the mechanics of it. The British march out to seize weapons, and on their 16-mile retreat back to Boston, they don't fight a traditional battle. They are hit by a textbook rolling guerrilla ambush.
It was devastating for them.
The American militiamen don't line up in a field. They hide behind stone walls, they shoot from the windows of farmhouses, they fire from behind massive oak trees, and as soon as the British form up to charge them with bayonets, the Americans just run away, reload, and find another tree.
And the British commanders were absolutely furious. Lord Percy, one of the British leaders that day, wrote a letter complaining bitterly about what he called the skulking way of war.
Skulking.
He was disgusted. To the aristocratic British officer class, this tactic of hiding, shooting, and running away was cowardly, dishonorable, and fundamentally uncivilized.
I always laugh at that because the British essentially wanted the Americans to be polite enough to stand in a neat, densely packed line in an open field so the British could shoot them efficiently. To the British, it was an offense against honor, but to the American farmers, it was basic logical survival.
Of course it was.
They knew with absolute certainty that if they tried to stand toe-to-toe with British regulars in an open field, they would be slaughtered in 5 minutes.
Yet, it is vital to understand that the American Revolution was not won solely by scrappy guerrillas hiding in the woods. If that were the case, the British eventually would have hunted them down.
So how did they win?
The colonies utilized what military strategists today call hybrid warfare. On one hand, you had the irregular militias in the countryside constantly harassing British supply lines, cutting off their communications, and making it impossible for the British to control anything outside the major cities. They were the mechanism of attrition.
Right.
But on the other hand, you had George Washington desperately trying to build the Continental Army.
Right. Washington wanted a conventional force. He brought in European officers like Baron von Steuben to drill his men, to teach them how to march in columns and how to use the bayonet.
Precisely, because Washington understood the limits of the guerrilla. The militia could harass the British, but they couldn't force a British army to surrender. You need a conventional army that can actually stand its ground, lay siege to fortifications, and deliver the final knockout blow, which Washington eventually did at Yorktown.
That's the annihilation part.
Exactly. This hybrid approach, combining the endless, exhausting attrition of the guerrilla with a concentrated annihilation of a conventional army, has consistently proven to be the most successful formula for an insurgency in modern history.
But the funny thing is, the word guerrilla itself doesn't actually exist yet during the American Revolution. Washington never used that term. We don't get that specific word until the early 1800s. Where does it come from?
It originates during the Peninsular War, which raged from 1808 to 1814. Napoleon Bonaparte, the undisputed master of conventional, decisive, annihilating battle, decides in his arrogance to invade and occupy Spain.
Which didn't go well.
Well, initially it did. He easily crushes the formal Spanish regular army. By all conventional metrics, Spain is defeated, but the Spanish people absolutely refuse to submit to French occupation. They organically rise up across the countryside and form partidas de guerrilla, which literally translates from Spanish as little war.
And these Spanish guerreros were absolutely lethal. I mean, we always think of Napoleon's empire being destroyed by the freezing Russian winter or the muddy battlefield at Waterloo, but the numbers tell a different story.
What do the numbers say?
These decentralized Spanish insurgents, fighting in the mountains and ambushing supply convoys, accounted for the vast majority of the 180,000 French casualties during that 6-year war. They made the Iberian Peninsula a massive bleeding ulcer that drained the French Empire of manpower and morale.
And this era of the late 18th and 19th centuries ushers in a wave of what historians call the liberal revolutions. You have the Spanish fighting the French occupation. You have Giuseppe Garibaldi leading his red shirts in a brilliant, irregular campaign for the unification of Italy.
Right.
You have the Greeks fighting a brutal insurgency against the Ottoman Empire.
It's just happening everywhere.
And perhaps most dramatically, you have the Haitian slave revolt, led by brilliant tacticians like Toussaint Louverture, who used disease, terrain, and irregular tactics to defeat the armies of the French Republic.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because we talked earlier about how the ancient empires, Assyria, Rome, used pure, unadulterated brutality to crush rebellions, flaying people, making deserts. But we also just established that Europe had developed these new civilized rules of war, uniforms, honor, the Peace of Westphalia.
Right.
So when these liberal revolutionaries rise up in Spain or Haiti, do the established civilized states play nice? Do they use restraint when fighting irregulars?
The short, brutal answer is no. Restraint, honor, and the rules of war were largely reserved exclusively for other formal, uniformed European armies. When a European state faced an internal rebellion or a colonial uprising of non-uniformed irregulars, the gloves immediately came off.
The civilized rules just went out the window.
Completely. Look at the French Jacobins during the Vendée uprising in France in the 1790s. The peasants in the Vendée region rebelled against the revolutionary government in Paris. The government's response was not to win their hearts and minds. They utilized total scorched earth tactics.
What did they do?
They sent infernal columns of soldiers to systematically burn every farm, slaughter the livestock, and execute hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children. They did the exact same thing in their desperate, failed attempt to crush the Haitian Revolution.
I have to push back here, though. Because in modern military doctrine, we constantly hear that brutality and counterinsurgency always backfires. The modern mantra is that if you bomb a village and kill innocent civilians, you don't defeat the insurgency. You just radicalize the survivors and create 10 new terrorists for everyone you kill.
That is the modern conventional wisdom, yes.
But historically speaking, did these absolute scorched earth tactics actually work for the French back then?
What's fascinating and deeply unsettling about the historical data is that extreme brutality can work, but only under very specific, horrific conditions. It can succeed if the state is willing and culturally able to engage in mass murder on a scale that would be completely unacceptable and illegal for any modern liberal democracy.
God, that's dark.
It is. Furthermore, it only works if the insurgents are completely geographically isolated and cut off from outside support. The French Jacobins successfully crushed the Vendée Revolt because they were willing to massacre hundreds of thousands of their own citizens, and the rebels had no foreign allies coming to resupply them.
Ah, I see the difference.
But in Spain, the brutal French reprisals against Spanish civilians completely backfired. Why? Because it enraged the population, and the Spanish guerrilleros were constantly being supplied with weapons, gold, and intelligence by the British military via the coast. Brutality against a well-supplied enemy just fuels the fire.
So outside support is a massive defining variable, but there's another totally new variable that pops up during these liberal revolutions, and it might be the single most important weapon ever handed to the insurgent, the printing press.
Yes. The 18th and 19th centuries fundamentally introduced the concepts of mass propaganda and public opinion to asymmetric warfare. For the first time in history, insurgents aren't just fighting for tribal territory or loot. They are fighting for deeply abstract ideological concepts like liberty, nationalism, democracy, and human rights.
Ideas.
Ideas. And because of mass literacy and the printing press, they realize that they don't necessarily have to kill every single enemy soldier on the battlefield to win. They just have to win the battle of the narrative.
Think about this from a modern psychological perspective. How often do you watch a movie and instantly, almost genetically, root for the scrappy underdog against the massive, faceless, evil empire? Whether it's Star Wars, The Hunger Games, or Braveheart, we just love the rebel.
It's hardwired into us.
This era of history weaponized that exact human emotion. Revolutionaries used cheap pamphlets, widely circulated newspapers, and stirring romantic speeches to make the massive empires look like tyrannical, lumbering bullies.
They were appealing directly to the civilian populations back in the imperial capitals.
Right. London, Paris, Vienna, trying to erode the taxpayers' will to keep funding a distant, ugly war.
Giuseppe Garibaldi in Italy was an absolute master of this. He didn't just win battles, he cultivated an image. He wore a signature red shirt, he gave fiery speeches, and he became a global celebrity. Women in London and New York swooned over him. He was a romantic hero.
And once the international public falls in love with the insurgent, the empire has already lost the war of ideas.
So true.
And as we transition into the late 19th century, into the great wars of empire, this dynamic intensifies. The major European powers are expanding globally, carving up Africa, dominating Asia, pushing across the Americas, and they run headfirst into fierce indigenous resistance.
And because they are facing a PR nightmare back home if these wars drag on too long, the European military minds start developing much more methodical, scientific counterinsurgency doctrines. They realize they need a system of control that isn't just endless slaughter.
Right, and the most famous example of this new science control is the spreading oil spot strategy. Oh, yeah. This is a brilliant, albeit insidious concept coined by a French officer named Hubert Lyautey while he was tasked with pacifying Morocco. Tell me about the mechanics of the oil spot. How does it actually work on the ground?
The central idea behind the oil spot is slow, methodical, economic, and physical control of the population. Instead of sending massive columns of troops chasing highly mobile insurgents around the vast desert wilderness,
Yeah.
where the troops will just get exhausted and ambushed, the army establishes a highly secure, permanent outpost in a single village.
But they don't just build a fort with machine guns, right?
No, they build a medical clinic, they build a vibrant marketplace, they dig a clean well, they provide absolute security for the locals.
So they make the local population totally economically dependent on the empire. If your child is sick, you go to the French doctor. If you want to sell your goods, you use French currency at the secure French market.
Exactly. Once that specific area is deeply pacified and the locals realize their lives are materially better under imperial protection, the army slowly pushes the perimeter outward. They establish another secure post a few miles away, and then another, and another.
It operates exactly like a drop of oil, slowly, inevitably spreading outward across a piece of paper, staining and absorbing everything it touches.
It's a perfect visual metaphor. The insurgents are slowly pushed out into the barren wilderness where they have no food and no recruits. It is the direct intellectual precursor to the modern population-centric counterinsurgency doctrine that militaries use today.
But the indigenous populations fighting these empires reacted in wildly different ways. And the ones who succeeded were the ones who truly understood the guerrilla paradox. There is a stunning, tragic contrast from the late 19th century that perfectly illustrates this.
Let's hear it.
In 1898, at the Battle of Durman in the Sudan, a massive army of Islamic fighters known as dervishes decided they were going to fight the British Empire conventionally. They massed their forces and charged directly at the British defensive lines in broad daylight across an open plain.
Big mistake.
Yeah, because the British had brought the Maxim gun, the first fully automatic machine gun. The dervishes were absolutely annihilated. Tens of thousands of men were mowed down in hours. It was mechanical slaughter. They tried to play the Empire's game and they lost everything.
Conversely, look at the exact opposite approach taken by Muslim rebels in the jagged Caucasus region, led by a brilliant tactician named Shamil, who fought the expanding Russian Empire in the mid-19th century. Shamil clearly understood he couldn't beat the massive Russian army in a pitched battle on an open field, so he refused to give them one.
He went to the mountains.
He waged a grueling, excruciating 30-year insurgency in the high mountains and deep forests of Chechnya and Dagestan. He used elaborate ambushes, he exploited the harsh, freezing terrain, and he frustrated generation after generation of Russian czars.
30 years.
He only finally surrendered when he was literally trapped in a high mountaintop fortress, heavily besieged, with just 400 surviving men completely surrounded by 40,000 Russian troops. He made the empire pay for every single inch of rock in blood and gold.
It really emphasizes the absolute rule of asymmetric war. If you do not have the heavy weapons and the industrial base, you must use the skulking way of war. You must embrace attrition.
Absolutely.
But while these massive colonial wars are raging on the frontiers of the empires back in the dense, modernizing cities of Europe and America, a much darker, much more concentrated form of asymmetric warfare is brewing. This is the invention of modern terrorism.
To properly define and understand terrorism, we actually need to take a brief step back to the 11th century Middle East to a group known as the Assassins, or the Nizari Ismailis.
Oh, the Assassins.
They were a fiercely persecuted minority Shiite sect living in isolated mountain fortresses, the most famous of which was Alamut in modern-day Iran. Their leader, a brilliant and ruthless man named Hassani Saba, realized an essential mathematical truth. He simply did not have the manpower to field an army to fight the dominant, massive Sunni empires that surrounded him.
So if you can't kill the enemy's army, what do? You bypass the army completely. You just kill the leadership. He trains these highly devoted, incredibly disciplined, covert operatives called fedayeen.
And it's worth noting, the English word assassin actually comes from a historical slur used by their Sunni enemies, who claimed these operatives were hyped up on hashish before they killed.
But modern historians agree they weren't drug-crazed lunatics. They were cold, calculating, deeply trained, and religiously fanatical.
The mechanics of their operations were terrifyingly patient. A fedayeen would infiltrate a rival city. They'd spend months, sometimes even years, learning the language, establishing a fake identity, and getting close to their target. And then, at the perfect moment, usually in a highly crowded public place like a mosque during Friday prayers, they would pull out a concealed dagger and stab a prominent politician, general, or cleric to death.
And what makes them so profoundly terrifying is the psychology of the escape, or rather, the lack of one, because they genuinely believe that dying in the act of killing an enemy of their faith guaranteed them immediate entry into paradise. They rarely even tried to run away.
They would strike and then calmly wait to be cut down by the victim's bodyguards. They were, in physical and psychological effect, the world's first suicide attackers.
They terrified the political elite of the Middle East for over a century. Kings literally wore chainmail under their robes just to sleep. They were only finally stopped when they encountered an enemy who possessed absolutely no deterrent fears.
The Mongols.
Right. The Mongols swept through the Middle East, cared nothing for Islamic theology, and simply eradicated the assassins' fortresses with massive siege engines.
But the assassins were ultimately limited by the technology of their era. A dagger can only kill one specific person. What makes modern terrorism so devastating is a massive, world-altering technological leap that occurred in the mid-19th century, specifically the year 1866.
That is the year Alfred Nobel, the same guy who later founded the Nobel Peace Prize, invented dynamite. And when you combine the explosive power of dynamite with the invention of the highly concealable breech-loading revolver pistol, the entire destructive power equation of the human race is radically, permanently altered.
It changed everything.
You no longer need to train an army of 10,000 men to cause mass casualties or cripple a city. A single, dedicated, angry individual with a stick of dynamite concealed under a heavy winter coat can walk into a crowded cafe, a busy train station, or the path of a royal carriage and alter the course of history in a microsecond.
Exactly. It completely democratized destruction. You used an analogy earlier about tech startups. The invention of dynamite is the 19th century equivalent of giving a lone, isolated computer hacker a sophisticated virus that can instantly take down a major city's entire power grid. The barrier to entry for causing mass terror dropped to near zero.
Wow, that's a wild thought.
We see this immediately implemented in two very early, highly effective terrorist campaigns right here in America. Before the Civil War, you have the radical abolitionist John Brown. He realized peaceful protests weren't ending slavery, so he utilized extreme violence, midnight assassinations, and terror tactics, hoping to spark a massive, violent slave uprising across the South.
And immediately after the Civil War, you have the exact opposite ideological spectrum, the
Right.
Ku Klux Klan. They utilized targeted assassinations, horrific public lynchings, and pure psychological terror to systematically dismantle and overthrow the biracial Reconstruction governments in the South.
And this brings up a really crucial defining distinction that military historians make between guerrillas and terrorists. Because in the media, we tend to use those words interchangeably. We just call anyone fighting the government a terrorist.
But mechanically, while they both use asymmetric, unconventional tactics, they are not the same thing.
Not at all.
Guerrillas are usually a significantly larger armed force. We are talking thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of fighters. They operate primarily in a recognized physical war zone, and their ultimate goal is to harass the enemy military, wear them down, and eventually seize and hold physical territory to govern.
Precisely. Whereas terrorists, historically speaking, are usually tiny, highly compartmentalized groups, maybe just a few dozen or a few hundred deeply radicalized people. Because the numbers are so small, they do not have the logistical capacity or the manpower to fight in the woods, ambush military convoys, or hold a village against a conventional army.
So they bypass the military entirely.
They strike soft targets, they hit unprotected civilians on the home front, they bomb restaurants and hijack planes. Their strategic goal is not to physically defeat an army on a battlefield. Their goal is purely psychological.
They're trying to trigger a massive, overwhelming reaction.
Yes, they hope that a spectacular, horrifying bombing will either force a terrified government to immediately concede to their demands, or that it will wake up the apathetic masses and spark a sudden, spontaneous nationwide revolution.
So if I can synthesize this, is terrorism essentially just the guerrilla warfare of the hyperweak?
Yes, that is exactly how military strategists view it. What's fascinating here is that they resort to hiding bombs in civilian trash cans in major cities precisely because they lack the numbers, the weapons, and the complex logistics to sustain a true rural guerrilla campaign out in the field. It is the weapon of ultimate physical weakness, masked by sudden, shocking bursts of extreme violence.
So we move out of the 19th century and plunge into the absolute meat grinder of the 20th century. And the first half of the 20th century is entirely dominated by the ultimate catastrophic conventional conflicts, World War I and World War II.
Millions of men dug into muddy trenches, thousands of armored tanks rolling across Europe, massive armadas of bombers turning whole cities to ash.
You would naturally think that guerrilla warfare guys hiding in the woods with rifles would be entirely laughably obsolete in the face of that kind of apocalyptic industrial slaughter. But history surprises us again. Out of the shadow of these massive world wars emerges a totally new phenomenon, state-sponsored irregulars, the birth of the special forces.
The most famous romanticized figure of this era is undoubtedly T.E. Lawrence, immortalized in film as Lawrence of Arabia. During the grinding stalemate of World War I, the British military intelligence sends this eccentric, brilliant scholar to the Middle East.
His mission is to organize the fractured Arab tribes into a cohesive revolt against the Ottoman Empire, which was allied with Germany.
Lawrence is a fascinating historical subject because he didn't just fight, he deeply intellectualized guerrilla warfare. He stepped back and analyzed the psychology of the Arab tribes. He realized they fought for honor and booty, and they would simply melt away into the desert if they suffered heavy casualties like European soldiers in the trenches. He codified this new strategy of endless harassment.
He understood the power of the narrative, too. He famously wrote, "The printing press is the greatest weapon in the armory of the modern commander." He knew that keeping the disparate Arab tribes motivated, spreading propaganda, and shaping the political narrative in London and Cairo was infinitely more important than the actual physical shooting.
He also came up with this very famous, almost algebraic equation for guerrilla victory.
Let's hear the formula.
He claimed that if insurgents possess four things, mobility, security, meaning unassailable geographic safe havens where the enemy literally cannot reach them, like the deep desert, time, and a compelling political doctrine, then, he claimed, victory will rest with the insurgents.
He makes it sound like a mathematical certainty. Just plug in those four variables, carry the one, and you defeat an empire. But looking at the harsh reality of history, is it really that simple?
It sounds beautifully elegant on paper, and it looks great in a textbook. But military historians are very quick to add a massive, undeniable caveat to Lawrence's mathematical formula. Lawrence's strategy worked in the desert, largely because his Arab irregulars were quietly backed by the full, unimaginable industrial might of the British Empire.
Oh, right.
They had the Royal Air Force flying top cover and bombing Ottoman trains. They had the Royal Navy securing the coastal ports to bring in supplies. And they had millions of British gold coins explicitly funding their tribal operations. Very, very few insurgencies in human history ever have the luxury of a global superpower acting as their personal logistics, funding, and air support wing.
So without the superpower,
When you remove that massive pipeline of outside support, the cold truth is that most insurgencies actually fail. They starve, they run out of bullets, and they are crushed.
and World War II proves that even the biggest, most mechanized conventional armies on Earth desperately needed these unconventional, sneaky fighters. You have these incredibly eccentric, brilliant characters emerging. Guys like the British officer Ord Wingate, who was deeply unconventional.
Very unconventional.
He led irregular guerrilla forces behind enemy lines in Palestine, in Abyssinia against the Italians, and deep in the jungles of Burma against the Japanese. You have Josip Broz Tito, the rugged communist leader whose localized partisans fought so fiercely they managed to tie down dozens of elite German divisions in the mountains of Yugoslavia divisions Hitler desperately needed on the Russian front.
And to officially support groups like Tito's partisans, the British government formalized the irregular approach. Winston Churchill explicitly ordered the creation of the Special Operations Executive, or SOE, and the Special Air Service, the SAS.
Churchill's famous, dramatic mandate to these units was to set Europe ablaze, right?
Yes, these were highly trained, unconventional commandos. They were parachuting behind German lines in the dead of night to sabotage rail yards, blow up strategic bridges, and train local French and resistance fighters in the dark arts of assassination and demolition. It definitively proved that even an army of millions of men with thousands of tanks still needed irregular super soldiers to disrupt the enemy's fragile supply lines in the rear.
And the semantics, the linguistic gymnastics during this time are just wild to look back on. Both sides are playing massive psychological games with language to shape public perception. The German High Command issues strict official orders that resistance fighters in occupied countries are absolutely never to be referred to as partisans or soldiers. They must exclusively be referred to in all documents and media as bandits or terrorist gangs.
They want to completely strip them of any political legitimacy or honor.
Meanwhile, back in London, the British government is issuing stern memos to the BBC insisting that Tito's communist fighters in Yugoslavia should only be called freedom fighters. It's the ultimate historical proof of that old cliché. One man's terrorist is exactly another man's freedom fighter, depending entirely on which side of the radio broadcast you happen to be listening to.
And that psychological framing, that battle to be seen as the legitimate, righteous underdog, becomes the absolute defining characteristic of global conflict after 1945. Because the end of World War II fundamentally shattered the long-held, deeply racist myth of European imperial invincibility.
Yeah, the empires were crumbling.
The great colonial powers, Britain, France, the Netherlands, emerged from the rubble of WWII economically exhausted, deeply in debt, and physically bankrupt. More importantly, colonized people all across Asia and Africa had watched these supposedly superior European empires get absolutely humiliated and routed by the Japanese army in the early years of the war.
It shattered the illusion. It proved to the colonized world that the imperialists could bleed and they could be beaten.
This sets the perfect volatile stage for the era from the 1950s through the 1980s, an era defined by a phenomenon called radical chic.
This is the golden age of the leftist revolutionary. Powered by the massive polarizing dynamics of the Cold War, you see strict Marxist economic ideology fused perfectly with fierce anti-colonial nationalism. And the developing world just explodes in insurgency. This is the era of the global icons, the one-name gurus of guerrilla war. Mao in China, Ho in Vietnam, Fidel and Che in Cuba.
These leaders didn't just fight, they became potent global symbols of resistance. They wrote dense theoretical manuals on warfare that were read by college students in Paris and Berkeley. They vividly demonstrated that massive Western firepower has severe, fatal limitations if you change the rules of the game.
Like in the Philippines.
Exactly. In the Philippines, the Communist Hug Rebellion seriously challenged the newly independent U.S.-backed government. And of course, in Vietnam, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army managed to completely bog down the United States military, the most powerful industrial force on the planet.
Yeah, they proved that if you meticulously apply the Maoist doctrine of protracted people's war, which means spending years quietly building deep, unshakable political roots among the rural peasant population and absolutely refusing to engage the enemy's main forces in a large battle until you hold an overwhelming guaranteed advantage, you can successfully exhaust a nuclear superpower.
But the conventional militaries, especially the United States and Vietnam, really struggled to intellectually grasp this mechanic. They treated it like a conventional war of annihilation.
Right. The U.S. applied massive, almost unimaginable levels of indiscriminate firepower. We are talking fleets of B-52 bombers conducting carpet bombing, dropping millions of gallons of napalm, and declaring massive swaths of the countryside as free fire zones where anything that moved was considered an enemy.
And the historical analysis highlights the tragic flaw in this. This reliance on overwhelming kinetic firepower often drove the terrified, fence-sitting civilian population straight into the waiting arms of the communist insurgents.
It is a fundamental truth. You cannot win a delicate war of ideas by burning down the very village you are claiming to save. True counterinsurgency requires treating the civilian population as the ultimate prize to be protected, not as the physical battlefield to be destroyed.
Well said. While these massive rural guerrilla wars raged in the jungles and mountains of the developing world, the 1970s also saw a simultaneous massive spike in urban terrorism. And strangely, much of it was heavily romanticized by the radical left in wealthy Western democracies.
You had groups of radicalized middle-class college students forming outfits like the Baader-Meinhof gang in West Germany and the Red Brigades in Italy. They kidnapped prominent politicians, they robbed banks to fund their operations, and they hijacked commercial airplanes.
And crucially, you have the rise of the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, led by Yasser Arafat. They bring international terrorism directly into the modern media spotlight like never before.
The dramatic airplane hijackings in the desert, and horrifically the Munich Olympics massacre in 1972, where Palestinian terrorists took Israeli athletes hostage on live global television.
They realized a dark truth about the modern media landscape. A single, highly dramatic act of spectacular violence, broadcast live via satellite to millions of living rooms across the globe, could instantly force the entire world to pay attention to their political cause, regardless of how small their actual fighting force was.
Yet, despite all the magazine covers, the hijackings, and the fear they generated by the late 1980s, the era of the Marxist insurgencies largely fades out. The pure, ideologically rigid, leftist revolutionary groups across Latin America and Europe just wither away and collapse.
They do.
So why did that happen? Let's analyze the mechanics of their failure. Did these Marxist groups fail militarily on the battlefield? Or did they fail politically? I kind of view it through that tech startup analogy again.
I like this analogy. Let's hear it.
These leftist insurgencies were like a heavily subsidized, unprofitable tech company. They had a massive, wealthy backer in the form of the Soviet Union. The USSR was providing the ultimate venture capital. They provided millions in hidden funding, endless crates of AK-47s, sophisticated training camps in the desert, and secure safe havens in Eastern Europe where terrorists could hide from Western intelligence.
Okay, I see where you're going.
And when the Berlin Wall falls in 1989 and the Soviet Union completely collapses, that global venture capital completely, instantly dries up. The structural support vanishes, and the business of leftist terrorism goes bankrupt.
That is a very apt, structurally sound analogy. The collapse of the Soviet Union was undeniably a devastating logistical and financial blow to these groups, but historians argue it was also a terminal ideological blow. As the Iron Curtain fell, the catastrophic economic failures and human rights abuses of communist states became undeniable to the entire world.
So nobody wanted what they were selling anymore.
Exactly. It became practically impossible to convince an angry young man in Colombia or Germany to sacrifice his life for a glorious Marxist utopia when the actual existing Marxist states were revealed to be impoverished, oppressive, gray dictatorships. So it was primarily a profound political and ideological failure.
But some groups survived, didn't they?
However, it is vital to note a crucial distinction. While the purely economic Marxist groups vanished, the groups that married their violence to deep-seated nationalism, like the PLO fighting for a Palestinian state or the IRA fighting for a united Ireland, survived much, much longer. Historically, nationalism, the desire for your own land and identity, has proven to be a far more durable, potent, and motivating force than pure Marxist economic theory.
But as we know, nature in geopolitics abhors a vacuum. With secular leftist Marxism thoroughly discredited and defunded, a new, much older, and far more uncompromising grievance steps right into the void to take its place: religious fundamentalism. And historians point to one specific, highly volatile year that completely changed the trajectory of the modern world. That year is 1979.
1979 is the absolute watershed year of the late 20th century. Three distinct, earth-shattering events occur in rapid succession. First, The Islamic Revolution in Iran successfully overthrows the immensely powerful U.S.-backed Shah, establishing a radical, uncompromising Shiite theocracy.
That's one.
Second, a group of heavily armed Sunni extremists violently seizes the Grand Mosque in Mecca, Islam's holiest site. It is a deeply shocking, bloody event that absolutely terrifies the Saudi royal family and pushes Saudi Arabia to adopt and export an even stricter, more rigid interpretation of Islam to appease the radicals.
And the third event.
And third, in December of that year, the massive conventional army of the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan.
And that Soviet invasion of Afghanistan sparks a massive, brutal guerrilla war. The Afghan Mujahideen, a loose coalition of fiercely independent tribal fighters, wage a relentless insurgency, and crucially, they are heavily funded, armed with advanced Stinger missiles by the United States CIA, and bankrolled by Saudi Arabia.
Talk about outside support.
Exactly. They bleed the Soviet Union dry in the mountains. It becomes the USSR's version of Vietnam, but the long-term consequence is that it empowers and radicalizes an entire generation of fighters from across the Muslim world who flock to Afghanistan. They leave that war genuinely believing that they have literally defeated a global nuclear superpower, not through technology, but purely through the righteous power of their faith.
Out of this intense religious ferment, we see a dramatic, terrifying shift in tactical methodology. In the early 1980s, amidst the chaos of the Lebanese civil war, a Shiite militant group emerges called Hezbollah. And Hezbollah successfully revives a devastating tactic that hadn't really been seen on a massive scale since the days of the ancient assassins with their daggers and the Japanese kamikaze pilots of World War II, the suicide bombing.
The mechanics of this are just horrifying. The 1983 truck bombing of the U.S. Marine barracks in Beirut instantly kills 241 American service members. It is devastating. And as military strategists explain, suicide bombing is the ultimate unstoppable weapon of the weak and the fanatical.
Think about the physics of it.
Right. If you have a fighter who is not only willing to die, but actively wants to die to achieve martyrdom, you don't need a complex guidance system. You can turn a cheap delivery truck packed with fertilizer into a precision-guided, devastating missile. It is impossible to deter someone who wants to die. Furthermore, Hezbollah was incredibly media-savvy.
They pioneered a highly effective form of hybrid warfare. They combined these asymmetric, spectacular terror strikes with a highly organized political wing that ran schools, built hospitals, and provided trash collection. They built incredibly deep, unshakable support among the marginalized Lebanese Shiite population by providing the social services the government couldn't.
But while Hezbollah was primarily focused regionally on Lebanon and Israel, a wealthy veteran of the Afghan war named Osama bin Laden decided to take the concept of religious terrorism completely global. He founded al-Qaeda. Unlike localized traditional rebels who are fighting to control a specific valley or a specific country, bin Laden marshaled a truly transnational insurgency.
His stated grandiose goal was to bankrupt and destroy the United States, drive Western influence completely out of the Middle East, and establish a borderless, global Islamic caliphate.
And what's fascinating is the paradox of his methods. He preached an ancient medieval version of religion, but he didn't try to achieve it by hiding in a cave with a sword. He used the very tools of modern Western globalization against the West.
With the paradox.
He used satellite phones to coordinate strikes. He used encrypted internet forums to spread propaganda. He exploited the international banking network to move millions of dollars invisibly. And eventually, tragically, he used commercial airliners. Al-Qaeda was structured almost exactly like a modern multinational corporation. I remember reading that recruits arriving at their training camps in Afghanistan literally had to fill out bureaucratic HR-style questionnaires answering mundane questions like, what are your hobbies and who should we contact in case you become a martyr?
That bureaucratic structure highlights how serious they were. Bin Laden and his top lieutenants were highly educated, calculating men who deeply studied military strategy. They explicitly studied the secular leftist guerrillas. They read Mao Zedong. They studied General Giap of Vietnam. They analyzed Che Guevara. They deeply understood the historical mechanics of asymmetric warfare. And they motivated their foot soldiers through a psychological framework that terrorism experts often call the 3 Rs.
Let's break those down. What exactly are the 3 Rs of modern terrorism?
Revenge, renown, and reaction. First, revenge. They tapped into a deep well of anger, seeking violent revenge for perceived historical and modern wrongs committed by Western powers against Muslims worldwide. Second, renown. They sought personal glory and eternal fame for themselves through the act of martyrdom, celebrated in slickly produced propaganda videos. But the third R, reaction, is by far the most strategically important.
Explain the mechanics of the reaction. What did they want us to do?
This raises an important question. They desperately wanted to provoke the United States into a massive emotional overreaction. They wanted the U.S. to use its massive conventional military to invade Muslim lands. Bin Laden's explicit strategy was to drag the U.S. into a grinding, unwinnable land war in the Middle East, hoping to bleed the American economy dry and exhaust public support in endless, costly occupations, exactly as the Mujahideen had done to the Soviet Union in Afghanistan in the 1980s.
Which leads us directly to the incredible carnage in Mesopotamia. Following the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, an invasion that easily, predictably dismantled Saddam Hussein's conventional army in a matter of weeks, a massive, chaotic power vacuum opened up across the country. And violently stepping into that void was a man named Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. Zarqawi was a high school dropout and a former street thug from Jordan who founded the group that became al-Qaeda in Iraq, or AQI.
The Iraqi insurgency following the U.S. invasion was incredibly complex and multi-layered. On one hand, you had former Iraqi military officers from Saddam's Ba'ath Party fighting a fairly traditional nationalist guerrilla war. They used sniper rifles and buried artillery shells, improvised explosive devices, or IEDs to target American military convoys. It was classic hit-and-run attrition. But Zarqawi, driven by a deeply radical sectarian hatred, took the violence to a horrifying, unprecedented new extreme.
Zarqawi didn't just target American soldiers. In fact, he largely ignored them. He targeted Iraqi civilians, he dispatched suicide bombers into crowded markets, he blew up deeply sacred Shia mosques. He instituted the horrific practice of televised beheadings of foreign hostages, making sure his fighters wore black masks and read long religious manifestos on camera. It was entirely theatrical, designed for the internet age.
His deliberate, calculated goal was to spark a massive, bloody sectarian civil war between the Sunni and Shia populations of Iraq. He wanted to make the country completely ungovernable. And for a few dark years, it absolutely worked. The sectarian violence in Baghdad reached apocalyptic levels. Bodies were dumped in the streets every morning.
But Zarqawi's strategy of absolute nihilistic violence ultimately contained the seeds of its own destruction. And this ties perfectly back into the concept of the 3 Rs. Zarqawi wanted a reaction. He wanted chaos. But the reaction he ultimately provoked from the local Sunni population, the very people he claimed to be fighting for, was utter revulsion.
Which is exactly what brought AQI down. AQI was brutally murdering respected local tribal sheikhs who disagreed with them. They were forcing incredibly harsh medieval religious laws on a population that just wanted to live their lives. They were murdering far more Iraqi Muslims than they were killing Americans. They completely, fundamentally alienated their own base of political and logistical support.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the surge in 2007. This is the exact pivotal moment we described at the very beginning of the episode, with Captain Bernays sitting in that cafe in Baghdad. The situation is dire, and General David Petraeus takes command of U.S. forces. He implements a brand new, radically different counterinsurgency doctrine, which he literally helped write, outlined in Field Manual 324. Let's talk about the mechanics of the surge. What changed on the ground?
Petraeus deeply understood the history of guerrilla warfare. He realized that the heavily mechanized U.S. military could not win this war by sitting securely inside massive, heavily fortified bases and occasionally driving out in armored convoys to kick down doors and kill suspected bad guys. That was the exact search-and-destroy mentality that had failed so spectacularly in Vietnam.
Because it just measured success by enemy body counts, but it left the civilians totally unprotected.
Exactly. So Petraeus orders a massive paradigm shift. He orders the combat troops off the big bases. They move out into the chaotic neighborhoods. They build small combat outposts right in the middle of the city. They sleep there. They live among the Iraqi people. This is the implementation of the clear and hold strategy. You fight block by block to clear the insurgents out of a neighborhood. But then, and this is the crucial part, you leave your troops there permanently to protect the civilians so the insurgents cannot return at night to intimidate them.
But it's vital to note that the U.S. troops didn't pacify Iraq just by standing on street corners, because at the exact same time, a massive organic political shift occurred. The local Sunni tribes, who were completely disgusted and exhausted by al-Qaeda and Iraq's psychotic brutality, decided to turn against the terrorists. This was known as the Anbar Awakening, or the Sons of Iraq movement. The U.S. military recognized this shift, and they started actively paying and arming these former Sunni insurgents to fight AQI instead of fighting Americans.
Yeah, exactly. It was the perfect synergy. The new U.S. tactical posture finally provided physical security for the population, and the local population, in turn, provided the crucial intelligence needed to root out the terrorists. That combined pressure effectively crippled al-Qaeda in Iraq. But I want to pose a question to you, synthesizing everything we've discussed so far. Why did the United States succeed in temporarily turning the tide and stabilizing Iraq in 2007 when a modern military like the French failed so miserably to hold Algeria in the 1950s and the U.S. itself failed to hold Vietnam? What was mechanically different?
Looking at the historical analysis, there are a few key variables that made Iraq different. First, the U.S. in Iraq was actively supporting a newly elected Iraqi government. Now, it was deeply flawed and corrupt, but it had a measure of democratic legitimacy, unlike the French trying to maintain a colonial dictatorship in Algeria. Second, as the sectarian civil war raged, the U.S. combat troops were increasingly viewed by the average Iraqi civilian as the only neutral arbiter capable of stopping the slaughter between Sunni and Shia death squads. They weren't viewed solely as occupiers, they were viewed as a necessary police force. And third, and perhaps most importantly, the U.S. explicitly stated they were leaving. They signed a status of forces agreement with the Iraqi government guaranteeing they would pull their troops out. They signaled they did not want an indefinite, permanent colonial occupation, which removed the primary nationalist grievance of many insurgents.
That analysis perfectly proves that counterinsurgency is, at its absolute core, fundamentally a political endeavor, not just a kinetic military one. You cannot shoot your way out of an insurgency. You have to govern your way out of it. Which brings us to the culmination of our entire deep dive today. The author, Max Boot, takes these 5 millennia of bloodshed, from Sargon spears to Zarqawi's IEDs, and distills them into a series of core, undeniable historical insights. He calls them the lessons of history.
Let's hit the most vital ones, because this is the absolute cheat code for understanding global conflict. Lesson number 1. Guerrilla war is the norm. We constantly treat asymmetric war like it's a frustrating anomaly, a deviation from the rules. But looking at 5,000 years of data, massive conventional state-on-state war is actually the historical exception. From the Guccian Highlanders to the Taliban in Afghanistan, irregular, messy warfare is the default setting for human conflict.
Lesson number 2. Conventional military tactics do not work against unconventional threats. Search and destroy missions, which rely on heavy firepower, airstrikes, and massive sweeps through territory, inevitably alienate the local population and completely fail to secure the ground. True counterinsurgency requires clear and hold. Protecting the civilian population must be the primary, overriding military objective.
Lesson number 3, and frankly, I think this is the biggest takeaway of the entire show. Outside support is the single most important factor determining whether an insurgency succeeds or fails. If you have a foreign power supplying you with modern weapons, endless funding, and a physical safe haven across a border like the French supporting the Americans in 1776, or the CIA supporting the Afghans in the 1980s, your statistical chances of winning skyrocket. Without outside support, isolated insurgencies almost always run out of bullets and lose.
And lesson number 4. Public opinion has become the ultimate decisive battlefield. In the ancient world, it didn't matter what the peasants thought of the Roman emperor. Today, it matters entirely. Modern guerrillas are intensely ideological. They are hyper-focused on the battle of the narrative. They win not by destroying the enemy army, but by convincing the opposing public, through media and propaganda, that the war is morally bankrupt, too expensive, or simply unwinnable.
But I want to add a dose of reality here. Because despite all the terrifying media attention, despite the fearsome global reputation of groups like Al-Qaeda or ISIS, the historical data points out a crucial, comforting fact. The vast majority of insurgencies still fail.
They absolutely do, because while it is mathematically very easy to hide a bomb in a marketplace, blow things up, and spread panic, establishing genuine, long-lasting political legitimacy and building a functional shadow government that can actually fix potholes and run schools is incredibly difficult. Most terrorists and guerrillas are very good at destroying, but they simply cannot offer a viable, functioning political alternative to the state they are trying to overthrow.
But looking at the trajectory of history, we've seen that technology, the bronze shield, the Roman catapult, the Maxim machine gun, the stealth bomber, has traditionally heavily favored the massive conventional army. The rich state gets the best toys. But I have to ask, as we look at the modern landscape, is technology starting to shift back? Is the digital age starting to favor the agile guerrilla?
That is a very real, very pressing concern among military strategists. As modern societies become increasingly complex and deeply technologically dependent, they paradoxically become much more vulnerable. Think about cyber warfare. The viral spread of deepfakes and algorithmic propaganda on social media allows completely stateless actors to punch vastly above their physical weight class. A smart kid with a laptop in a basement in Eastern Europe can potentially cause billions of dollars in economic damage or sway a democratic election without ever firing a single bullet or crossing a physical border. The financial and logistical barrier to entry for conducting asymmetric warfare is lower today than it has been since the Stone Age.
Think about the news you read on your phone this morning. How much of it is genuine information, and how much of it is actually a carefully orchestrated battle for public opinion managed by invisible armies? The historical lines between physical warfare, domestic politics, and global media are now completely irreversibly blurred.
And that profound thought brings us full circle. Those exhausted American paratroopers walking the dark, dangerous streets of Baghdad in 2007, drinking Pepsi to gather intelligence and speaking through masked interpreters, were unknowingly participating in a ritual that is as old as human civilization itself. They were battling the absolute latest iteration of the ancient nomad paradox, the heavy, static, heavily armored state desperately trying to swat the agile, invisible mosquito.
It is incredibly humbling to think that the exact same tactical and psychological dilemmas faced by Sargon of Akkad and the commanders of the Roman legions are still thoroughly confounding the smartest minds at the Pentagon today. It completely reshapes how you view every headline about modern conflict.
But I want to leave you with one final, rather chilling thought, drawn directly from the epilogue of our historical deep dive. The author modifies a famous philosophical quote, stating with grim certainty, "Only the dead have seen the end of guerrilla war." We have spent the last hour tracing how leaps in technology, from the domestication of the horse to the printing press to the invention of dynamite to the commercial airplane, has continually amplified the destructive power of the lone, irregular fighter.
So what is the next logical step in that progression? What happens next?
Ask yourself this. What happens when the ancient, emotionally driven, impossible to eradicate tactics of the guerrilla finally intersect with the ultimate apocalyptic technologies of the 21st century? Imagine a highly radicalized 10-person terrorist cell. They don't have a standing army, they don't control a recognized state, and they don't care about public opinion. But somehow, they manage to acquire a biological weapon, perhaps a highly contagious, genetically engineered virus, or a stolen tactical nuclear device. Suddenly, in the blink of an eye, that tiny, invisible band of irregulars possesses more sheer destructive power than the entire conventional army of the Roman Empire, the British Empire, or the United States combined. They wouldn't need to wage a decades-long war of attrition. They could bypass the state entirely. It is the ultimate terrifying nightmare scenario of the guerrilla paradox, and is something to seriously mull over the next time you hear about an asymmetric conflict breaking out on the news.
A deeply sobering thought to end on, but an absolutely essential one to truly understand the fragile, complex world we live in. Thank you for joining us on this 5,000-year deep dive into the mechanics of the invisible army. We hope it gave you a completely new lens to view the sweep of history and the reality of the daily headlines. Keep questioning the narrative, stay insanely curious, and we'll see you next time.